Hey, it's Cassidy, your friendly internet tired writer, and welcome to another video. Around a month ago, I made a video talking about the 3 key aspects to villains. I kind of wanted to explore that a little bit more, talk about it in a broader lens, because I think it's a pretty important topic to the larger conversation of classic versus modern stories, which is a conversation that I have been having on my channel. I have a playlist, if you want to check that out. So, what is the difference between classic and modern villains? The 3 principles of effective villains. In the Bowser video, I called them key aspects, but I prefer the term principles, so I'm going to call them principles now. There are generally 3 principles that go into creating an effective villain. These principles not only make the villain an effective antagonist for your story, but they make the villain an effective antagonist that the audience can invest in. Now, whether they invest their empathy or their vicarious will to destroy everything, well, that depends on the person. Principle 1, threat level, aka what? The threat level answers the question, what is the villain doing that makes them a villain? When writing a villain, you need to make sure they actually do villainous things. The classic show versus tell. You want to show their villainous actions instead of character A telling character B that the villain is villaining. In my work in progress, which is coming out at some point this year, there are gods who kinda suck, and I wanted to show right off the bat that these gods suck, so I made them kill a bunch of people, and they also ate one dude alive. If that doesn't say these guys suck, I don't know what does. It'd be kind of like if the MCU built up Thanos to be this horrible villain that was gonna destroy half the universe, and he didn't. Principle 2, power level, aka how. The power level answers the question, how is the villain doing or getting away with the thing that makes them a villain?
So,
your villain is doing bad things, but why can't people stop them? In fantasy, it's usually because the villain has more power than the good guys. Really though, the villain just needs an advantage over the good guys or whoever they're opposing. So this doesn't actually need to be physical abilities or superpowers, but if you want to have a story that lasts longer than the first confrontation, then the hero or the people opposing the villain need to be at some sort of disadvantage. That's how the villain gets away with being a villain. For example, Light, the protagonist in Death Note, is pretty much the smartest person in the world, except for one guy. L, the detective who is trying to take him down. He is arguably smarter. However, Light has the advantage because he has infiltrated L's task force, which is trying to take him down. This allows him to be close enough to the investigation and the detectives to always be one step ahead of them. That's how he gets away with his crimes.
I'll take a potato chip and eat it.
The villain needs to have an advantage for at least most of the story. At least until your protagonist finally defeats their inner demons and resolves their daddy issues and realizes the power of love and friendship and elevates to god status. Principle 3, motivation, aka why though? Motivation answers the question, why is the villain doing the things that makes them a villain? It can be as simple as chaos or as complex as trauma, but your villain needs to have a reason for doing what they do, just like any other character. It's pretty self-explanatory, so I'm gonna go into this a little bit deeper later on in the video. The modern 4th principle. Those 3 principles have basically been present in all of history. I mean, it's literally just how conflict works. However, there is a 4th principle that modern stories and writers have not necessarily introduced, but definitely made more mainstream. Principle 4, humanization, aka who? Experiences, hobbies, quirks, beliefs, all of these things combine to create a character. Humanization allows you to explore the villain as a character rather than just a villain. Humanization and motivation will often influence each other because after all, you don't get to the why without knowing the who, and the why will change the who, so then what actually comes first, the who or the why? Because really, you could argue that as soon as the why is conceived, the who is no longer the same who they were before the why, because what are whys if not not critical points in our evolution. Classic versus modern motivation. Motivation in modern stories is typically more of a focus than in classic stories. Think about the evil for the sake of evil trope. How the villain would do something bad just because the plot needed them to, and they were given a very shallow and uninteresting motivation. Yes, not every classic villain suffered from this lack of complex motivation, but that lack is practically non-existent in modern stories. Even remakes and renditions make sure to give the villain a deeper and more complex motivation. Even if it's not all that interesting, at least they try. Classic villains typically focus on threat level, whilst modern villains typically focus on humanization and motivation. Maleficent is a perfect example of this. In Sleeping Beauty, Maleficent curses Princess Aurora to prick her finger on the needle of a spinning wheel and fall into a sleep-like death, all because she wasn't invited to her birthday party. I mean, I haven't been invited to every single birthday party ever, and I didn't come to that conclusion. But to each their own. So revenge is one of the oldest motivations in the book. Revenge is kind of like a stock image. It's there if you can't take the picture yourself. Revenge is the stock motivation you use if you can't think of anything else. Don't get me wrong, there are many classic and modern stories with complex reasons behind the revenge, but I think revenge can very easily become a shallow and uninteresting motivation if there is not ample reasoning and exploration of that reasoning behind the motivation. It's like evil for the sake of evil. Revenge for the sake of revenge is boring. And it's not really a motivation that's likely to build a connection with the audience unless it's explored and developed beyond, I'm mad at you, so I'ma ruin your life. Now, the modern version of Maleficent decides to curse Princess Aurora because she wasn't invited to her birthday party. And because the king was her childhood sweetheart who cut off her wings while she was sleeping to become king. So, fair. Revenge is still the basic motivation, but there's substance to the motivation. Instead of cursing a baby to die because she didn't get invited to her birthday party, Maleficent curses a baby to die because her dad royally screwed her over and literally maimed her. So instead of revenge being a stock image, it's a picture you actually took yourself. My point is, it's more interesting. And I think it's because the focus in the classic movie was on her threat level and power level, and the focus in the modern movie is on her humanization and motivation. And because of the shift in focus on the more emotional aspects of the character, it lets the audience establish a connection to the villain. I mean, what do you connect with more? Cursing a kid because you weren't invited to a baby's birthday party? Or cursing a kid because her dad betrayed you and cut off 2 of your limbs? The latter. The classic version of Maleficent is basically just a narcissist, and the modern version is traumatized. If that's not a good example of the difference between classic and modern stories, I don't know what is. Classic versus modern humanization. When it comes to villains, classic stories didn't spend a whole lot of time trying to humanize them. Yes, maybe they had backstories where they weren't bad and they were actually good and they had good intentions, but they just became evil. But in the present timeline of the story, they are often boiled down to their bad actions. They don't often have characteristics beyond the ones essential to creating the villain. They are villains first, characters second. Modern villains are characters first, villains second. Like, the trend now is to create a human first and then put them into their specific role in the story. Modern villains are not boiled down to their bad actions. Some of them have good traits. Like, some of them are like kind of caring to certain people. They are given reasons for being the person, being the villain that they are. Which leads me to one of the biggest differences between classic villains and modern villains: mental health. Bet you didn't see that one coming. I said in my Bowser video that it can be hard to humanize serious and dramatic villains, but really any type of villain, without giving them mental health issues. even if it's just subtext. Like, mental illness and trauma are the go-to ways to make a villain more human and more empathetic to the audience, because it works. Most people feel bad for people struggling with mental illness. While this is a very effective way to humanize a villain, it's not the only way. Like I said before, villains can have good traits. Trauma and mental illness are not the only way to make a person gray. Whether it's the environment they're raised in or other experiences, some people just come to darker conclusions than others. And it's not always due to their brain chemistry. Classic villains. More iconic? A tangent. Is it just me? Or are classic villains way more iconic than modern villains? Maybe it's just because they've been around longer. I don't know. But I think because the only thing a villain had to do was be a villain, kind of made them stand out because they had to. Classic villains were often relegated to a secondary position in the story. They were not going to be fleshed out as much as the main characters. So it's almost like writers had to assign them a few really memorable characteristics, and if it's a visual medium, a very memorable design to make them stand out. Characters like the Joker and Sauron are extremely different, but they're both really iconic. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that they were not the main character, and thus were not going to be fleshed out beyond a few traits. Like, Joker is super quirky, and his design is super memorable. And Sauron is basically the devil, but all of that devilry and evil is contained within a tiny object, a ring. I think a lot of modern villains, because they are way more complex and fleshed out, and because the focus is on their humanization and motivation rather than their villainy, are actually less iconic. I think the most iconic villains from the 2010s, at least in the sci-fi and fantasy realm, are probably Loki and Thanos, and I don't think it's just because the MCU was extremely popular in that decade. I think it's also because they are a mix of classic and modern. You know, they have the classic villain design and some of their traits. Loki is kind of the joke villain, Thanos is the more serious and intimidating villain, but then they also have strong motivation and humanization. You know, they are complex characters. It's sort of rare these days for a villain, in my opinion, to really stand out from other modern villains. Unless modern villains have something that makes them really memorable, like Thanos and Loki, I wouldn't be surprised if they're forgotten. So it's a double-edged sword. Modern villains might connect with the audience more, but classic villains are more memorable. I guess in our search for complexity, we've forgotten that there is beauty in simplicity. Conclusion. Classic villains and modern villains follow the same principles, they simply focus on different ones. Classic villains are summed up by what they do. Modern villains are summed up by why they do what they do and who they are. Audiences want to connect with characters, both good and bad. Connecting with villains might be a subconscious way of testing your empathy, or maybe it's simply living vicariously because, let's be real, most of us are probably not going to dominate the world, but we've all thought about it. There's a strange rush to having your morals tested in a way that won't affect your life, and that's what connecting with villains can do. Modern villains offer that connection. They are designed to connect. Classic villains don't really want to connect. They want to entertain the audience and make life hell for the protagonist. And you know what? Maybe that's good sometimes. Maybe some people don't want to connect. Maybe some people just want to watch the world burn. I'm done ranting now. Well, I hope you enjoyed that video. Another reminder, this is all my opinion. I am not an expert at anything. Wish I was, but I'm not. Basically, take what I'm saying here with a grain of salt. Now for some self-promo. I have written 5 books. This is before I turn 18. It is a literary anthology filled with poems and rants about the transition from adolescence to adulthood. It is an existential crisis in a book. This is We Shall Reap. It is a standalone fantasy set in a Middle Eastern inspired land, and it is basically about these different people who need to find this ancient artifact. They all have their own reasons, some of them selfish reasons, some of them not selfish reasons, but basically it is a very morally gray story, and if you're looking for a happy fantasy, this is not the book for you. So if you're looking to be a little bit uncomfortable about some characters, And this is the Mortal's End trilogy. I wrote it when I was 13, 14, and 15. Basically, it's about this war against this sorceress who might want to watch the world burn. It's very Tolkien-esque, but written by a teenager, so, you know. All 5 of them are available on Amazon. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.